Hello, book number 3 by Richard Peck. This book is called A Season of Gifts, and it is a follow-up to A Long Way from Chicago and A Year Down Yonder. It still includes good old Grandma Dowdle and her little town in central Illinois. And so let's see where Grandma Dowdle goes for this one. Chapter 1, Locked and Loaded. You could see from here the house was haunted. Its crooked old lightning rods pointed bony fingers at the sky. It hadn't had a lick of paint since VJ Day, maybe the war before that. A porch sagged off the side. The kitchen screen door hung from a hinge. Only the snowball bushes crowding its foundations seemed to hold the place up. At nights, lights moved from room to room. Every evening, just at dusk, a light bobbed down the walk to the cob house and the privy behind, and back again. My little sister, Ruth Ann, couldn't take her eyes off the place. She'd rest her chin on the windowsill and plant her nose on the screen wire. What else did she have to do? It's like Halloween here in August, she'd say. I bet you there's spooks inside that house. No, Mother said behind her, no spooks. What do you think, Bobby? I was Ruth Ann's big brother, so she thought I knew things. Spooks or not? Over her head, Mother gave me one of her direct looks, so I said, probably not. But even when Ruth Ann took her hula hoop and her doll buggy out on our front walk, she was all eyes. She'd watch the house while she revolved in her hoop and rocked her doll. She spent a lot of time outside hoping a friend would happen to her. So we, Barnharts, had moved in next door to a haunted house, if a house can be haunted by a living being. But the old lady who lived over there had to be just this side of the grave with one foot in it. She looked older than the town, but she was way too solid to be a ghost. You sure couldn't see through her. You could barely see around her. A long straight garden grew down this side of her property. Every blazing morning, she'd tramp off her back porch and down her garden rows with a hoe humped on her shoulder. Her straw hat looked like she'd swiped it off a mule. It hid her face except for the chins. She worked right through high noon in a fog of flies, hoeing and yanking weeds and talking to her tomato plants. The heat slowed her some, and the flies, but she could be amazingly light on her big pins. We'd already seen her take a broom and swat the Fuller brush man off her porch. She kept right at his heels till he was off her property. Now, back in the old days, they went door to door selling brushes and brooms, so that's what the Fuller brush man did. As everybody knew, she didn't neighbor, and she went to no known church. She was not only really cranky, but well armed. Word was that she had a regular arsenal of weaponry behind her woodbox. They said it was like Fort Leonard Wood behind her stove. They said she was locked and loaded. She had to be pushing 90, so rumors had grown up around her. One was that her property was on top of an ancient Kickapoo burying grounds, and that's spooky right there. Now, Kickapoo's a tribe of Indians from Illinois, and we know Kickapoo well near us. Only a ragged row of fleshy red canna flowers separated her garden from our yard. You children stay on this side of the cannas, Mother said. Let's let sleeping dogs lie. Mother didn't have to worry about me. I was a boy, but not that brave. I wouldn't have set a toe over that line. And she didn't mean my big sister Phyllis, who was sulking upstairs over having to start high school in a new town. Mother meant Ruth Ann. She was hard to keep track of unless she was following you around. Remember who we are, Mother said, and we're new here. All eyes are upon us. It wasn't going to be the kind of town that rolls out the welcome mat. Still, a few people brought us things to eat just to see us up close. On a good day, an angel food cake. Moore's IGA store sent us some half-price coupons and a sample size of Rinso soap. But Moore's was cash and carry, and we didn't have any cash. Toward the end of our first week, somebody left 5 dandy ears of sweet corn on our porch. They were half silked to show the pearly kernels, but unknown hands had left the corn. They couldn't be from next door, since no corn grew in Mrs. Dowdle's garden. Chapter 2, Revival dust. I tried to make August last because September and school didn't look good. We were not only newcomers, but we were PKs, preacher's kids. So everybody'd be gunning for us and we'd be living in a fishbowl. But not yet, not in August. Cut this much slack. Let's get settled here in this new house before we have to take on the town. The house was okay, and I had my own room. Let's give thanks that we have an indoor bathroom, Dad said. The town was still crawling with privies and pumps, though our house and the house next door were about the only ones without television antennas. Around here, you needed an antenna twice as high as your house if you had television. Mother stood over Ruth Ann at our side window, gazing out past the peeling house next door to open, empty country. I take back every bad thing I ever thought about Terre Haute, Mother often said in a far-off voice. Now, Terre Haute's in Indiana. We saw a lot of Mrs. Dowdle next door. There was a lot of her to see, but she never seemed to see us back. She didn't have time. On a circle of burned grass in her yard, an iron pot hung from a tripod. She seemed to be pulping down apples for apple butter over a white-hot fire. She stirred an ancient paddle with holes in it. Once in a while, she'd stand back to mop up under that mule hat. Then back to stirring she'd go, two-fisted on the long paddle. I bet you that's witch's brew in that cauldron, Ruth Ann said, very interested. I bet you Mrs. Dowdle has warts where you can't see. There are no witches, Mother said. There are only old ladies who prize their privacy. Mrs. Dowdle weeded like a wild woman. Only when somebody passed on the road would she stand up and glance that way, running a hand down her back. Never waving. There were a bunch of boys in town, big ugly ones. They tramped past, heading for the creek every afternoon, punching each other. Mrs. Dowdle always watched them out of sight. She seemed to take an interest in them, but not a friendly interest. Then she'd have several sharp things to say to her tomatoes. One evening, we were just settling around the supper table. There were some slices of ham from somewhere. Mother pulled together a potato salad out of 3 potatoes. We joined hands, and Dad began. For what we were about to receive, when an almighty explosion rocked the room. Our kitchen clock stopped, and the box of matches jumped off the stove. Every nesting bird in the county took flight. Russians, we thought, and without a civil defense bomb shelter for miles. Another explosion erupted and bounced off every house from here to the grain elevator. Ruth Ann slid off her chair and was at the kitchen door. We all followed. Now Mrs. Dowdle, gray in the gloaming, loomed out from around her cob house. In one of her hands hung a double-barreled shotgun, an old-time Winchester 21, from the look of it, and both barrels smoked. In her fist, she carried a pair of headless rats. They hung by their tails, and they were good-sized, almost cat-sized. She lumbered up to her cauldron and swung the rats onto the white embers beneath. As a family, we turned away just as they burst into flame. This is why the Methodist Conference stuck us in this house, this so-called parsonage, Phyllis said. Who else would live next door to her? I hate this town. I can't tell you how much. Headless rats darted across my dreams through those nights. By day, I helped Dad down at the church. There'd been a church building to spare when the 2 bunches of United Brethren united again. They naturally went with the better church building, brick. We got the other one. And it looked like corn crib than anything else. 1 puff of wind from a pile of kindling. Somebody'd shot out all the windows, and the roof was a sieve. Dad had already killed a hog snake coiled up in the choir loft. He and the snake met by chance, and all Dad could think of to do was drop a box of hymnals on its head. And if you don't like spiders, this wasn't your kind of place. We kept busy. I sanded and shellacked the pews. Dad fitted the windows with plastic sheeting. There wasn't money for plate glass. There wasn't money for anything. We were eating off our own front porch. Dad sang hymns while we worked. Stand up for Jesus. Peppy hymns. He had a fine baritone voice, only a little wobbly on the high notes. I'd jump in with some harmony from him, though I was still pretty much a soprano. We must not, we must not, we must not suffer loss. We sang, singing a rafter or two. I didn't think we were half bad. But Dad was a worried man. He could do about anything with his hands. He had big hands, but it was going to take more than hammer and nails. Over in Terre Haute, he'd been the assistant pastor at the Third Methodist. This was the first pulpit all his own. It was going to be make it or break it for Dad here. And we hadn't seen many of those Methodists we'd heard were waiting for the word and a preacher to bring it. Still, we had time to get the place squared away. August was the big tent show revival month. You couldn't get a church off the ground until the revival dust settled. A sign appeared out by Mrs. Dowdall's mailbox. Spare rooms for believers. A tent the size of Ringling Brothers' Big Top rose in the park uptown, the bald ground between the business block and the Norfolk and Western Railroad tracks. A giant banner stretched high between the tent poles reading, "You think it's hot here?" The number one evangelist of the Sawdust Circuit was coming for a week of preaching. He was Delmer Gypsy Pigott, well known in his time, though his time was running out. They called him the Texas Tornado for his preaching style. He'd built a big tabernacle at Del Rio. We didn't go that Monday night. Local preachers and their families didn't. It wasn't our kind of worship. Besides, money in the revival's collection plate was money that never made it to ours. In a week, Gypsy Pigott could scare a lot of money out of town. But the revival came to us. Cars and trucks passed our house and out of town. You could hear everything from here, 4 blocks from the tent. Mother tied on a fresh apron, and we sat out on our front porch, hearing the gospel quartet, 4 high sopranos in some very close harmony, backed by a blare of trumpets, and they could belt out a hymn. Don't give me no newfangled religion, slick as a Cadillac's fin. Just give me that old-time religion and the way things was back then. Mother sighed from the porch swing. Then Gypsy Pigott climbed onto his pulpit. They had a dynamite speaker system. The whole county could stay home and hear every word. His fist was on the Bible, was like an earth tremor. The collection plate rang like an alarm bell. He didn't mince words either. He had us sinners in a fiery pit before you knew where you were. We were all on the wrong path, and Gypsy Pigott knew where it led. Liquor and bad women were mentioned. His language was pretty rough, and he had no grammar to speak of. Mother sent Ruth Ann into the house for all the good that would do. It's what people want around here, Phyllis said. That's why they are what they're like. Why are we even here? Nobody'll want real church. I hate this podunk town. Late that night, I was jolted awake. It had to be midnight when Mrs. Dowdall's screen door banged 2 or 3 times, and feet scuffled on her back porch. My window looked down on her place. Moonlight was slick on her tar paper roof. Yellow light fell from the kitchen windows across the porch floor. Stuff began to fly off the porch and bounce in her yard. Suitcases, trumpet cases. More came. White moths seemed to flutter across the grass, but it might have been sheet music. I couldn't see how many people were on the porch, but it was Mrs. Dowdall who barged through them and outside. She wore a nightgown the size of the revival tent. Cold moonlight hit her white hair loose in the night. She held something high and poured from it into the ground. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, she bellowed into the night. Proverbs 21. You look it up. I don't have hard liquor in my house. It goes, and so do you. She seemed to pour strong drink out on the grass. Now she hauled off and threw the bottle. She had an arm on her. The bottle glinted in the moonlight, hit her cob house roof, and rolled off. Now, Mrs. Dowdall, a voice said, calm yourself. A man hath no better thing under the sun than to eat and to drink and to be merry. Ecclesiastes 8:15. I'd have known their voice in the fiery pit. It was the Texas Tornado, Delmer Gypsy Pigott. Now I could hear Mother and Dad stirring around in their room. My nose was flat to the screen wire. Get off my place, Mrs. Dowdall bellowed, and take these sopranos with you. Trumpets, strumpets, everybody out. More shoe scuffling came from the porch, and the peck of high heels. A sob and some squealing, and the gospel quartet milled. "You've rented your last rooms in this town, you two-faced old goat," Mrs. Dowdle thundered. "The whole town is wide awake now. Hit the road." "Dad burn it, Mrs. Dowdle," the Texas tornado whined. "We done paid for the whole week with ready money, cash on the barrelhead." "I'm about a squat jump away from a loaded Winchester 21, Mrs. Dowdle replied, "and I'm touchy as a bull in my fly time." She turned back against a tide of sopranos and stalked into her house. Whether she was going for her gun or to bed, nobody could know. The figures milled some more. A suitcase came open, but then they started for the road. A big Lincoln Continental was parked out there, washed by moonbeams. Doors banged and the Lincoln gunned away, shaking off the dust of the town. A room away, Mother sighed. Then silence fell upon the listening town, and the moon slid behind a cloud. Somewhere farther out in the fields, a swooping owl pounced on a squealing mice. But they were faint squeaks and far off. Chapter 3. The Boy Next Door. Dad and I had to keep wringing out our shirts all that next day. It was 100 in the shade, hotter inside the church. He sent me home early. As I came past the park, they were already taking down the big revival tent, folding the tent and stealing away. They'd only managed to pass the collection plate the first night, thanks to Mrs. Dowdle. Now the Texas tornado was having to touch down somewhere else. People may have hated to miss the rest of revival week, but telling each other how Gypsy Pigott was chased off was interesting and some consolation. I never knew any place where news traveled faster. It wasn't as slow a town as it looked. The sidewalk along the main street petered out before it came to our house. I walked out in the road with the hot concrete eating through my sneaker soles. I expect my mind wandered. It did that a lot. I remember starting to reach down and pick up a fuller brush on the side of the road. Right about then, I knew I wasn't alone. They came up behind me before I could think. Somebody walked up my sneaker heels. A big bruiser was suddenly on each side of me, and more of them behind. It was the gang of big uglies who headed out this way every afternoon. Fear trickled down my spine. A big thorny hand slipped under each one of my armpits. "Just keep right on walking," a weirdly soft voice said far above my head. But now my feet barely grazed the ground. "Just step right along, preacher's kid." We were passing our house now, and where was my "You smell funny, preacher's kid," said another voice from on high, and he should talk. "What's that you smell like?" "Shellac," I said in a puny voice. "I've been shellacking a pew." "Pew? You can say that again," said another voice, and they all did a lot of hee-haw laughing. We must have sounded like quite a friendly bunch, but who was there to hear? We were only a ditch away from Mrs. Dowdle's yard. Was this the first time all August she hadn't been out working in her garden? "You need to clean up and cool off, preacher's kid," came a voice. "You stink and you're sweating bad. You ever been to the crick?" I said nothing till a hand slapped the back of my head. No. It was open country now. We were off the slab and trampling the shimmering oiled road. Not a car on it, not a farmer in a field. I hung between two huge hulks as the town fell away behind us. They both wore yellow steel-toed construction boots. I was just a drop kick away from being booted over the next woven wire fence. Some big bird wheeled over us. A buzzard? A vulture? We tramped a mile easy. Then we were over the ditch, deep in milkwort and goldenrod. You could smell the crick before you got to the cattails in the trees. I smell it yet. Slow water and pond scum and rotten logs. The smell of August, 1958. Willows wept into the water, and I wanted to. The skeleton of an old snub-nosed rowboat was half buried in the bank. They turned me loose, and I chanced to look up at their main man. He was 6 foot tall. His sideburns were down to his jaw, and there was something wrong with his eyes. Now I was scared. "Skin off them clothes," he said, "every stitch." Now I was really scared. But they were all skinning off their clothes, work shirts, jeans, carpenter's apron, boots, tree limbs filled up with blue denim and army surplus. Then a giant hee-haw went up. Underwear? Preacher's kids wear underwear? Woo-wee! Got lace on it? Get it off. They sure weren't wearing any underwear. I had to notice because they were so tall, I only came up to their, Can you swim, preacher's kid? Said the tall galoot with the scary eyes. What was the right answer? Yes, no. A little. That's when I noticed they'd brought fishing line. 10-pound fishing line coiled in the weeds. But where were the poles? And where was the bucket of bait? The next thing I knew, I was in brown water. My nose up, then under, then sucking air hard. I was doing my best in that whirlpooly bend in the creek where I was just out my depth. I was kicking hard, but that's about all I could manage with both hands tied tight behind me with fishing line. I could have used web feet. They'd thrown me pretty far out, too. But you'd be surprised how much swimming you can do with your hands tied behind you. Swimming and drowning. 4 or 5 of the better-natured ones cheered me on from the bank, but I was going in circles, getting lower in the water. Then with big splashes, they were all in the creek, and they weren't out of their depth. They were neck and shoulders above the greasy water, batting me back and forth from one of them to the other, back and forth. We came back to town across country, quicker than the road. The fields were stubbly, but they let me keep my kids. They even put them on for me and laced them up because I was still tied tight. The sneakers were all I kept. My shirt and jeans were missing, and of course the underpants had to go. The rest of them were dressed and cool as cucumbers after their dip in the creek. But what could I say? Nothing, actually, because they brought out a roll of duct tape. A big patch of it was plastered over my mouth. The trees and roofs of town rose ahead of us. I remember our long shadows rippling across the furrowed fields. 6 or 8 overgrown galoots and me like a piglet on a spit, hanging from 2 of their big thorny mitts. They swung me over fences and I barely cleared barbed wire, and I mean barely. The closer to town, the nakeder I felt. They still might kill me, though they'd gone to the trouble of hoisting me by the heels on the creek bank and shaking a gallon of brown water out of me, but they could be saving me for later. The sun hung in the sky behind us. The day went on forever. The nearer to town, the quieter the gang got. They weren't the chatty type anyway. In fact, they only seemed to know a couple verbs. We were coming through orchards and now a melon patch. Through a stand of hollyhocks, I saw the back of the last house in town, Mrs. Dowdle's. Then ours next door and our car parked around back. I was that close to home and this close to crying. But it's almost impossible to cry when your mouth is taped shut, and you sure don't want your nose stopping up. We were behind Mrs. Dowdle's property. The Japanese lantern vine growing over her privy rattled quietly. We were quieter. Preacher's kid, the biggest galoot sighed down in my ear. What you've just had is a welcome to the community. It's our way of saying howdy. Now we're going to leave you in the hands of one of our solid citizens. But she ain't as friendly as us. She don't like nobody. What? What did this mean? What's going to happen to me now? Most of the gang melted away. 2 of them swung me into Mrs. Dowdle's privy. Then they went to work. I'll say this for them. They were artists with fishing line. They strung a giant spider's web that ran from the rafters to loose floorboards. Then they tied me in the center, bound hand and foot, and still gagged. I hung like a ham in a smokehouse, just over the hole in the well-worn seat. Keep us in your prayers, preacher's kid, said the big one, eerie and soft. Then they were gone. I was alone. This was about as alone as I'd ever been. Time passed, lots of it. Dimming light fell through the chinks of the privy and the half moon carved in the door. The smell in there was truly bad. I swayed slightly in my web and tried to take a positive view of the situation. I couldn't. For one thing, my knees were higher than my ears. It must be midnight, though. Daylight still came through the cracks. Maybe it was the next day. I sure would have liked to scratch my nose, but here's one good thing. They hung me right over the privy hole. My mind wandered, as it often did. I may have nodded off. My feet were sound asleep. And then the privy door banged open. Filling the doorway, and then some, was Mrs. Dowdle. A copy of the Farm Journal and 3 corn cobs were in one of her fists. I hadn't seen her close up. I never wanted to be anywhere near this close to her. Her specs crept to the end of her nose. We were nose to nose. She didn't welcome surprises, and I came as one. All she'd wanted to do was use her privy, and here I was barring her way, naked as a blue jay, in my own personal way. Her old pink-rimmed eyes grew larger than her specs. She poked them back up on the bridge of her nose and worked some of her chins with her free hand. I swayed. She looked my web over, up to the rafters, down to the floor. She may have admired the knots. "Well, I'll be a ring-tailed monkey if that don't take the cake," she remarked, "and I thought I'd seen everything." I made a small sound. She dumped her corn cobs in the Farm Journal and ripped the duptake off my mouth. "Yow!" I hollered. "Had to be done," she said. "Who'd you say you was?" I coughed up something, maybe a tadpole. "I'm Bob Barnhart, the boy next door." "Well, I can see you ain't the girl," said Mrs. Dowdle. Over in her cob house hung a pair of shears for trimming the snowball bushes. Mrs. Dowdle had them in both hands now, whacking at fishing line over my head. Sharp blades flashed. 3 more whacks, and I dropped onto the worn smooth privy seat over the hole. She bent my head forward and reached down my back to cut my wrists loose. I couldn't feel the ends of my fingers till the next Wednesday. She hunkered down with a grunt and cut my ankles free. "Woo, boy," she said. "I don't truss up my Christmas turkey that tight." She wound the fishing line into a ball, since she seemed to save everything. Now, without my fishing line, I was nakeder than before. "Keep your seat," she said, and she went back to her cob house. There was a world of tools and implements in there. A bunch of rusty rabbit traps hung on the outside wall. She rummaged around and came back with an old tarp, stiff with dried paint. She dropped it over me to cover me up. I edged off the seat, stood up, and fell in a heap of tarp on the privy floor. The blood wasn't getting to my feet yet. "Stir them stumps and try your trotters." Mrs. Dowdle started up her back walk. "Trail me up to the house." So I wobbled behind her up her back walk. In the tarp, I must have looked like a pup tent in sneakers. It gapped in the back, and I could feel breeze all the way down. Sunlight still flooded her kitchen. The wall clock read 4:45. I hadn't been in the privy as long as it seemed. A big black monarch iron range hulked along one wall. She'd never taken down a calendar, and one of them read, "Every good wish for brighter days in 1933. Mrs. Dowdle was bigger with walls around her and a ceiling. Her apron was full of bulging pockets. She was a walking Woolworths, a narrow-nosed handsaw, a claw hammer, clothespins, and now a ball of fishing line. "Trail me upstairs," she mentioned, "and don't trip on the tarp." She pulled herself up a long, shadowy flight of linoleum stairs. I followed. She wore giant felt shoes with one button straining over the foot. At the top of the stairs, she elbowed a door open. In there, dusty west light filtered through darned curtains. The windowsill was a wasp graveyard. An ancient brass bed angled out of a corner. The mattress looked like it was stuffed with corn husks. A darker triangle showed on the wallpaper where a pennant had hung. Mrs. Dowdle turned to a big chest and found what she was looking for, a shirt for a bigger boy than I. It was kind of old-timey, but I didn't come here to argue. It was faded out, but then so were my own 4 shirts. 3 now. Out of the drawer, she drew a pair of old dungarees. That's what we would call pants. "This is about the smallest I got," and she turned away to the window. I dropped my tarp. "As to underwear," she said over her shoulder, "the only pair that comes to mind was Dowdle's, my late husband, and they'd be 100% wool with buttons before and a trap door behind." "No, thank you, ma'am," I said. The shirt had been striped at one time, but it smelled starchy and clean. I could turn up the dungaree legs, but the waist was on the wide side. Mrs. Dowdle turned my way. The gold light pouring around her shadowed her face. But I saw right there that she was somebody else. Her old hand stole up to her mouth. She turned aside, and there was a glitter behind her glasses. "Last boy that wore them togs," she said, "was my grandson, Joey. That's been pretty near 25 years back. He's all growed. Don't ask me why I kept his stuff, except I keep everything. You never know." She blinked, and I saw I was holding up the pants. "Let me see what we've got for a belt." She inventoried her apron and came up with the ball of fishing line. Unwinding a shorter length, she handed it over, and I tied it around me. "You better skin home," she said. "They may not have missed you yet. You can grow into them clothes. They'll do you for school." I turned to go, ready to thank her. "Hold it," she said, and I froze. "Who's done this?" I teetered on the doorsill, and the other boys closed. "If I tell, I expect they'll kill me." Mrs. Dowdle shrugged. "They may kill you anyhow." So I admitted it was the bunch that headed out to the creek every afternoon. Their leader's older than a kid. "Has he got one blue eye and one green eye?" Mrs. Dowdle inquired. That was it. That was what was funny and scary about his eyes. "That'd be Roscoe Burdick. He's Mildred's boy, and he's bound to be 20 years old. I don't know what he's still doing around these parts, and at his age, most Burdicks is on the chain gang." She gazed away, recalling everybody's family history. No secrets around here. "As for the rest of that bunch," she said, "they're all Cowgills. Ernie's boys and Flukes, Augie's boys and Leapers, Elmo's boys, all dumber than stumps. Them families never was worth a toot. Not all varmints is four-legged. That bunch is the same ones who shot out all the windows in your church building." "Do they go to school?" Suddenly I was looking ahead into the terrible future. Now and again, some of them," Mrs. Dowdle said. "Not Roscoe, naturally. They's teachers younger than him. He spent so many years in first grade, they named the desk for him." Now I was looking ahead to going home, and my eyes were stinging. Last year, back in Terre Haute, when I was still a kid, I'd have gone home bawling. Now I didn't want to, and I never wanted anybody to know how Mrs. Dowdle found me in her privy, ever. She seemed to read my mind or something. "I expect you can get by in that outfit till you're up in your room and into your own togs. I wouldn't worry your folks if I was you. The way I hear it, they have troubles of their own. Anyhow, they'd just tell you to turn the other cheek, wouldn't they?" "That's exactly what they would tell me. It had to do with loving your enemies." "Trouble is," Mrs. Dowdle observed, "after you've turned the other cheek 4 times, you run out of cheeks." I couldn't figure out how to thank her. She was pointing me out of her grandson's room. "Joey's. I've got me a spare jar of apple butter," she said, "and I baked today. You can take a loaf to your ma. Tell her you found it on the porch." She was wheezing down the stairs behind me. The house shook. If she fell on me, I was a goner. "And don't look for anything out of the law around here," she said. "The Cowgills and the Leapers is kin to the sheriff. No justice in these parts. It's every man for himself." I felt the town tighten around my throat. "But as the saying goes, if you can't get justice," Mrs. Dowdle remarked, "get even." She kept right after me all the way down to the one-hinge kitchen door. Outside, the garden and the cannas were still as an oil painting. The sinking sun was fire red in all our side windows. Tools clanked in Mrs. Dowdle's apron pockets. In my puniest voice, I said, "You won't say anything about how you found—" "Never set eyes on you in my life," she said, locking the screen door behind me.